Good evening. Please take your seats. Good evening, and thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Jenna Burbich, and I'm a program officer of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. Welcome to this evening's program, Jordan, A Struggle for Peace in the Middle East. Before I introduce our speaker, please note that today's event is on the record and is being live-streamed. We always welcome social media engagement, but please silence your phones. The Council is an independent and non-partisan platform, and views expressed by individuals we host are their own and do not represent institutional positions or views of the Council. Thank you also to our members in attendance today. Your support is critical to our work. If you're not yet a member, please consider joining. We have a wide range of levels for you to choose from. If you have any questions on membership, please visit one of our young professional ambassadors just sitting there on the side of the room. Later, we will be taking audience questions from the room and online at chi.cnf.io, and that link should also be displayed on the screens. Now, ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker this evening. Rana Sweis is a Jordanian journalist covering political, social, and refugee issues in the Middle East. She's also the founder and managing director of Wishbox Media, provider of media training, research services, and creative storytelling packages. Her latest book, Voices of Jordan, is a compilation of stories about Jordan and the Middle East told through the lives of ordinary people, and it will be available for signing and sale from the bookseller following the program. I will be back on stage to moderate the audience Q&A, but for now, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our speaker, Rana Sweis.
Thank you so much for coming. I know it's really cold. Thank you, Jenna, as well, for the kind introduction. It's an honor to be here at the Council and to be here with you. One of the best days in my life was being here in Chicago when the Cubs won the World Series. My aunt, who's here today with us, but not a baseball fan, kept asking me why the game was taking so long, why I was so excited, and if I can turn off the lights and the TV already. So, as Jenna mentioned, I've been working on Voices of Jordan, a non-fiction book that tells the story of ordinary people coping with the aftermath of the Arab Spring and its unpredictable consequences. The idea really came to me when there was a lull in the Arab Spring and sort of the coverage of it after 5 or 6 years of covering it. I started reflecting on it and the uprisings and the results of them. Arguably, they continue today. And my initial thought was, if I could only take people living in the United States and Canada and Europe into their lives, minds, living rooms, and indeed the streets of Jordan. As many of you know already, Jordan stands out as a place where most personal stories are not marked by the kind of violent drama that punctuates international coverage of the region. And yet, to me, the 10 people who are featured in the book are a mirror of the Middle East itself. The collection of stories includes interviews and visits that span over 2 years from the north center, and south of Jordan. And one chapter is actually based in Chicago. It tells the story of a Jordanian who immigrated to Chicago. But the stories in Jordan range from a political cartoonist to a Syrian refugee to a fashion diva to a jihadi to a female parliamentarian. The stories are not entirely separate from each other. They're indeed more like conversations taking place in different rooms, but in the same building. I was fortunate enough to be able to enter each room and to listen and to observe and to question. Jordanians from different parts of society and outlooks share so much, even from the twin extremes of a fashion diva living among the privileged class of West Amman, who seeks to put her country on the map in world-famous fashion shows, to the young religious extremist struggling to carve out an existence in the harsh conditions of a northern Jordanian town. Ultimately, both voices are struggling and striving to understand how they fit in a rapidly changing region and a modern state with high aspirations for themselves and their families. The truth is, Jordan faces the same social and structural challenges that the rest of the region will have to tackle once the civil conflicts are over. Economic challenges, including one of the highest female unemployment rates in the world, establishing good governance, including transparency, accountability, and inclusiveness, which are all part of political reform, conversations about religion, and social infrastructure transformation due to urbanization. Moreover, my main aim, as I mentioned, was to write for readers like you who live outside the region. But the truth is, Jordanian lives do not overlap, leaving us in the dark about each other. Perhaps we do not have enough public debates or public spheres where we can debate serious issues and convince each other and collectively make decisions. And this is what the region desperately needs. And people and governments, including the United States, need to support this space as much as it is willing to support the country's security and stability. And this is what we need to be discussing, because people like Jamal Khashoggi spoke about the need for this space in his last op-ed in the Washington Post before he was brutally murdered in the Saudi consulate in Turkey. The political reality of the Middle East today is grim, and I think we're not debating enough the core issue, which is good governance and the failure of good governance, whether it's people struggling to have their voices heard or whether it's soaring rates of unemployment and poverty or anger and frustration at the lack of opportunities. But these challenges, as we know, have a way of impacting others in the world as well. We may be the hardest hit, but we all collectively pay the price. Europe, the United States, and Canada today find themselves increasingly struggling not only with refugees, but with economic migrants as well. In Jordan, more than 80% of Syrian refugees surveyed said they do not want to return to Syria, even though 82% of them are living in poverty in Jordan. So how does this impact Jordan? And what does that mean for the future of Syria? Unlike other countries in the region, Jordan's strength come from diversity and commonly held principles of tolerance. And that very diversity is an example for the region that must be preserved. If the traditional mix of culture in the Middle East is to be preserved, not least as we struggle with what we see and face in the region. Let me give you an example. When a colleague of mine from the New York Times, Rukmini Kalamaki, went to Mosul after the defeat of ISIS there, she found troves of documents which she and a team dissected to understand how ISIS ruled and how they were able to govern swaths of land. Two things stood out for me. First, ISIS in Mosul destroyed, the very first thing they did was destroy diversity or the other, so that anyone who was not Sunni was essentially erased from institutional files, expelled from their homes, from their lands, from their existence. Secondly, indeed, ISIS was ruthless in their suppression, but they also acted as bureaucrats. They made sure garbage was picked up from the streets. They didn't fire the Ba'ath-led bureaucrats as the Americans did in 2003. They forced the bureaucrats to continue their work, yet, of course, it was under ISIS rule. The majority of ISIS fighters that were interviewed and were captured in Mosul and Baghdad admitted they joined the fight for a promise of a salary and better security in their neighborhoods, even if they did not necessarily believe in the ideology itself. Indeed, many had little knowledge about their religion. So if this assessment is indeed true, then the environment in the region remains fertile for such groups and ideologies to return, even if it's under a different form and even if it's under a different name. So what do we need to focus on? Good governance. These are critical times ahead as plates shift across the region as well, whether it's the new relationship between the Gulf and Israel, leaving the traditional role of Jordan of bridging, which made it always an indispensable partner for the West, perhaps less certain today. And for the people of Jordan, they're still trying to figure out their role in the region, not only as a government, but as a people as well. The basic economic, political, and social model is under enormous strain as repeated reform efforts fail to launch in Jordan. The country faces the dual challenge of both shifting and uncertain relationships in the region and a declining domestic economic situation, which in my opinion poses the greatest risk to the long-term stability of the kingdom. Again, thank you so much for having me here. And I wanted just to take a moment with the presentation to show you some of the photos that we took in the field and talk just a bit more about the book itself, if I may. One of the reasons that I wanted to write this book is because I felt that there was not enough books out there that talked about modern-day life in the Middle East, and certainly not about modern-day life in Jordan. So I made sure that the characters, the 10 characters who are real, came from the north, center, and south. I know it may seem like many of them come from the center, but that's because half the population lives there. And I'll go ahead and just show you what is out there. While I was doing research, I found that there's a lot of books on tourism, biographies about kings and queens, novels as well. We have some good novels out there, and about archaeology and history. But not much about modern-day life, what life is like for the people there. And then I'll just show you some of the photos as well. The format of the book includes an introduction and 10 chapters, and and the epilogue. For me, I felt that to write a book that represents a nation, you need an entire choir of voices. So each character, for me, represents a large segment of Jordanian society. So whether it's a civil servant, where 42% of the population is actually working in the public sector, whether it's a female parliamentarian, so I would talk about politics and the law in Jordan and women as well. Through the characters, I wanted to also talk about the larger themes, as I mentioned. Through for example, the Syrian refugee, I could talk about the Syrian crisis and about the refugee situation, but also about the history of the refugee flows in Jordan as well. So I spent almost 2 years working in the field and interviewing people. So I focused, of course, on visited them at home, and we talked about their childhood, and went to work with them, using sensory to tell really the story. And these are some of the characters. This is Sultan. Sultan comes from the south of Jordan, and he lives in a very small provincial sort of town near Wadi Rum. So maybe some of you have been to Wadi Rum, and you probably drive right through his village but would never go there. So Sultan is a soldier right now. He used to work in tourism. And we talk about, in the chapter, we talk about his life as a Bedouin and how much it's changing. The lifestyle is changing due to technology. Even what they eat is changing, and sort of this generational gap. This is Amal. She's a Syrian refugee. Behind her is the Zatari refugee camp. She does not live there. She spent 4 days there, and she's living in the north of Jordan in Mafra, which is not too far from the border. And over 80% of Syrian refugees actually do not live in the refugee camps. They live in the urban areas. This is Sultan. She's a mother of 8 children. I wanted to write about a mother because the majority of women in Jordan do not work. So this represents a large segment of society in Jordan, but also about sort of her struggle and internalizing the need to have a boy. So she had 7 girls and then had this boy who was very spoiled. This is Lina. For me, she represents the youth in Jordan. Under 35 represents 70% of the population, but it's also about this struggle between the family, and they want to be sort of modern, and she uses social media a lot, and we talk about, I go with her to school, to public school as well, and we spend the day there. We talk about education in Jordan. This is Julius Akrush. He's a civil servant. He works in the passport department in Jordan. He's also, I would say, the Christian character in the book, who represents 3% of the population. And so we talk about diversity and Christians in Jordan in that chapter as well. This is the jihadi. He lives in Zarqa, in Rusaifa particularly, a town that I talk about extensively in the book. And he's walking in his neighborhood here. I met him at the State Security Court. This is the fashion diva. Behind her is what we call the new downtown in Amman. This is her with her family at home. This is the female parliamentarian I mentioned as well. Behind her is her town, Jarash. So it's one of, I would say it's equivalent to Palmyra in Syria. So people who take tours usually used to go to Jerusalem, Jarash, and then Palmyra. Of course, all that changed with the war, but we talk about her town, about her. I go with her on the campaign trail, what it's like to work in a also very conservative population over there. This is Omar. Omar is a political cartoonist. These are two of his characters. One, the man there, or the young man there, he sort of represents the ambitious, underemployed, educated young Arab who is a bit of a thug as well. As you can see, has cars and stuff. And it's about, again, them trying to find their worth and trying to find their ambition and their role in society and where they fit. These are paintings by an Iraqi artist. As you know, we also have another flow of refugees coming from Iraq in 2003, but many of them coming from Baghdad, who were artists, journalists, intellectuals, academic people. And this is the contribution that Iraqis have contributed to Jordan, which is really in the art and cultural scene as well. So these are some of the people, and you know, we can discuss a bit more about them maybe in the Q&A. But Jenna, if you'd like to open it up.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that presentation, Rana. We have some time for questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand, wait for the microphone, and please make sure your question is a question. Okay, we'll start with the President of the Council, Ivo Dalda, right to the front. Thank you.
Rana, thanks for coming back to Chicago.
Thank you. I'm still trying to convince you to be just a Cubs fan, not the national.
Always a Cubs fan, but there are just so many good teams. Tell us about which of the characters that you met was the most fascinating or most surprising for you, in what you learned from them as part of your story.
Oh, okay. I think, first of all, in general, the most fascinating thing I learned was how much we don't know about each other. And this was very clear to me with the soldier in the south and the female parliamentarian as well. She actually said it. But it does feel like people are not talking to each other, that we don't know about each other. And in a way, you can say this about other countries as well, like you live in a building, but you might not know your neighbor. It is true. However, if I want to reflect in terms of Jordan, I would say the reason being is that we lack and we need public spaces for public debates, where we can, where the street cleaner can talk to the mayor and ask him questions without it being in a hotel or a closed setting where people are intimidated to come to such events. But we need to have public debates to discuss issues that matter to people, not just at home, but actually in public, and collectively make decisions. This was just a thought I had, but I do feel like this is what we really lack in the region. And as for individuals, I like to say that people ask me, who's your favorite? And it's a bit like asking a mother who her favorite child is. And then when I thought about it, I would say they're all different, but that's what the mother says as well, right? But I think they are really, honestly, Ambassador, all very different. The jihadi was, of course, fascinating to me because, again, it's a segment of, let me not say people, but a way of thinking that we hear about, we think about, we come up with scenarios in our head, what they do in their daily life. But to actually spend 2 to 3 years in their home and talking about issues and why they think a certain way, and to look at the environment and really kind of spend time in that environment was fascinating to me. The Syrian refugee was a bit of a surprise to me because I went to interview her about her life in Jordan, but what I found was the real story was her life during the war in Syria. She was there displaced 8 times inside Syria before she came to Jordan and crossed the border, which was the 9th time she was displaced. So we talk about civilians caught up in the war and then her life and her family's life as refugees in Jordan.
Any other questions? Yes, the gentleman in the back.
I'd just like to mention that I met Steve. We were stuck on a plane for 8 hours yesterday, but in New York, but we made it, and we just kept praying that we would make it. But I was thinking this evening how nice it was to meet people like Steve and another Steve. I was stuck in the middle, so in the middle seat. So thanks for coming, Steve.
Thank you for doing this. I'm from Jordan originally. There's a thought that Jordan countries in the region, the reason we don't have good governance is because we have a lack of infrastructure, politics and organization, all that. But another one is that the people themselves are not ready for democracy and they're not ready to make the tough economic and political decision. From your experience, what do you think about that statement?
So sometimes the government says the people are not ready for democracy, right? But I want to say, like, Jordanians are really smart, and since you might know already, they're so politically savvy, and they're so connected online, and they're obsessed with news. They're like the biggest news junkies in the region, probably. And the government underestimates, I think, their knowledge and how much they're aware of how they feel and how policies are impacting them on a day-to-day life. And again, I think when we saw the June 2018 protests in Jordan, which were the largest since the Arab Spring, over a tax bill, but of course there are underlying reasons as well, I think it was clear that the population felt that they had no voice, that decisions were made on their behalf without talking to them. And there is a lack of confidence between the government and the people. Obviously, with an IRI poll, the International Republican Institute poll recently did a survey in Jordan and found that 50% of the people they surveyed feel like they're completely removed from any political or social or economic sort of decisions in Jordan. So you have 50% of the population completely out of the process and feel excluded. This is so dangerous. So I do believe that if we want to talk about combating corruption, for example, which is very high on the agenda for Jordanians, if we want to talk about transparency, if we want to talk about public debates, this is all part of democratization and political reform. You cannot talk about economic reform without talking about political reform. So in my opinion, Jordanians deserve to have democracy, and I think that the June 2018 protests demonstrated that. They still want to feel they have a voice, and in some ways, Syria and Iraq and Libya and other countries in the region scared them. and we do not have a good model in the region, but they were quiet for a while because of the fear factor of what may happen if if they sort of have their voice heard, if they do demand more and more reform. But I think it's time to get over that and actually implement political reform.
We have a lot of questions coming through on Conferences.io. I just want to remind you that you can also ask a question here by typing chi.cnf.io, especially for our digital audience. So a question from Conferences.io. How has Jordan managed to remain so stable in such a turbulent region?
It's a mystery, right? Again, I think, of course, I think the king does sort of represent keeping the country together. He's seen as the person to keep the population or the country together. But at the same time, I do think that Jordanians are very aware and they're very patient, and we have the waves of refugees, so they're very aware of if there isn't gradual and real sort of political reform, the consequences can be, quite dire. I think there is a bit of luck. There is a bit of geopolitical interest for the West to keep Jordan stable, whether it's for Israel, whether it's just by sheer luck of its location, they want it to stay stable. I think also a lot of credit goes to Jordanians themselves.
Yes, the lady in the second row.
Hi. Was it difficult as a female Christian to have access to these refugee camps and to speak to these people who sometimes, depending on their views on Christianity, how was that as a female Christian going and getting your information?
I can talk as, and you'll be surprised by this, but as a female, I felt that I had more access to people and places. If you're talking about the Bedouin and the Jihadi, I was able to interview all family members, whereas if I was a man, I wouldn't have been able to talk to the women. So ironically, I did have more access. I think for the Jihadi, he felt less threatened that I was female. I think if I was male, he would think that maybe I'm intelligence or whatnot, or from the security services. So it worked well for me, and I think, of course, my work in journalism as well helped me with the interviewing process as well. So it was good. And actually, the photographer and I worked separately because I wanted access to the females, and he sometimes couldn't. So we deliberately worked separately.
Yes, right at the front here, please.
Thank you for
just wait for the microphone.
Presentation.
Just the microphone.
Thank you for your, what a unique and interesting way to take a look at a country. I'm wondering about the role of civil society in Jordan and what kind of space it can occupy, and if that isn't a way, through a highly organized, persistent issue, advocacy group, if that isn't a way to get your voice heard.
I think civil society has a big role to play, even in the public debates that I was mentioning. And more support needs to go to civil society organizations. And, a lot of countries in Europe, like Sweden and other countries, they care a lot about civil society in Jordan, and they try to help. But also there are laws that make their life very difficult there. So we have to find a balance as well and support these civil society organizations, especially ones that want to help in terms of development.
Can I have a follow-up?
Yes, just wait for the microphone. It's coming right up.
So I'm wondering, is there freedom to organize around political issues, or are those kept under the radar? Do you have to be careful what you organize around?
So public assembly, you need permission to assemble. Yeah, you need to take permission to do that. You can't just organize, yeah. So, yeah, the space is controlled.
Yes, the lady in the second row.
Hi there. From your experience, how receptive do you think the natural-born Jordanians have been to the influx of refugees? And on top of that, do you think like the mass influx has had an impact on Jordan's economic climate?
So people ask me how, because we have, we're a population of 8 million almost, and then we had, almost 650,000 Syrians coming in. I would say two things have helped in terms of with the host community, with Jordanians. One is the language and culture. So there is empathy toward that and understanding toward that. So it was easier for them to kind of assimilate. And secondly is the proximity to Syria as well. I think many Jordanians are used to sort of driving 2 hours and ending up in Damascus. So there is a relationship between people to people in that sense, and religion to a certain extent. They share the same religion for the most part. As for the economic challenges with the influx, I think most of the challenges have been in the north, which is closer to Syria. And the challenges are in terms of water resources, because Jordan is the second or the third poorest country in terms of water resources. I think in services like garbage collection, public education. So we now have double shifts. So we have a morning shift and then an afternoon shift because the schools can't cope with the numbers. So it's impacted in that sense. But arguably, and I have to say, there is another side to this argument, is how did they contribute to the economy itself? So if you're if you own a building, for example, and you're renting out the apartments, the prices have gone up, you're benefiting. If you have a supermarket in that, or a grocery store in that area, you're making more money because there's supply and demand. So arguably, some people will say that they are contributing to the economy, but it is a very high number, and it is a very sort of, the demand is really high on things like the services and the infrastructure as well.
I'm going to take another question from Conferences.io and then come back to the audience. So this is a bit of a tough one. What advice would you give to the Trump administration related to crafting its Middle East policy?
I don't think he's going to listen to me.
But if he did.
So again, it's the U.S. foreign policy toward the Middle East is very much concentrated on military and security and sort of stability of these countries, whether it's Egypt, whether it's Jordan, whether it's Iraq. Arguably, it's still not. But, if you think about it, if you think about Syria today, half the country, 11 million people, so out of 20, are outside the country. They're displaced. 500,000 people have been killed. 500,000 people. That's 500,000 people. And, the leader is still in power. What does it mean, again, for the future of Syria? And the issues are still there. The issues that made people rise up in 2011, marginalization, freedom, all these concepts, they're still there. They haven't gone away. And they have not been addressed. They have yet to be addressed, even in the American foreign policy. So we need to move from stability and security into into supporting civil society, in terms of supporting people's voices being heard, in terms of the freedom of the press. These things that matter to political, social, economic reform, that matter to the populations there. And this is what's missing at the moment.
Yes, the lady at the front.
Thank you. So based on the statistics that you shared with us, can you please talk a little bit more about what it means to be a minority as a working woman in the Jordan society? How did you break that ceiling, and what are some of the barriers that you have to, I'm sure, like, deal with on an ongoing basis?
Thank you. It never dawned on me not to work. Like, why would you go to university? Like, this is how I used to think. Like, why would you spend so much time in education and sort of doing internships, right? If you're not going to do anything with it. So for me, it was a non-starter. Like, I'm going to have to find work. I want to work. So I don't see it as like breaking the ceiling or anything, but it is really sad for me to see so many educated women, because more women than men go to universities and graduate in Jordan, but then they just fall off in terms of in the labor market. And you know, it's not all because of there are no jobs. Of course, there are no jobs, but it's also about other things like lack of transportation. If you live in the north and all the jobs are concentrated in the capital, you're going to have to find transportation every day to go to 1 hour driving to the capital. And the transportation system is not helping at all. So they find it very difficult in terms of transportation, but also there are social reasons. You know, some of them, their husbands or their families don't want them to work. They don't want them to be, and you'll read a bit about the Bedouin, for example. He doesn't want his wife to be in an environment with other people. So there are social constraints, there are economic constraints, and there's simply the unemployment, like not finding jobs. The men are not finding jobs either. We have 30% unemployment rate.
Yes, all the way in the middle row, the lady.
Thank you. I actually was traveling to Jordan this summer, and I noticed a lot of the lack of literature on Jordan in the present day. The most recent thing I think I could find was actually Queen Noor's autobiography. So why do you think there is a lack of literature about modern day life in Jordan?
I had a really hard time finding a publisher. And one of the reasons that some of them were writing me that Jordan is not at war, there's not that drama, right? And but I really believe that if I just continue with these stories and telling these stories, which are really are representative of others in the region as well, I just thought if I can just continue with it, I know people would be interested in their stories and sort of going into the lives and living rooms and minds of these people. So I kept at it, and eventually, thankfully, a publisher in the UK thought exactly what you thought, and sort of took it up.
Yes, the lady right next to her.
So I also spent the summer abroad with Hannah in Jordan, and I noticed a lot of ongoing urbanization in the capital, Amman. And I was wondering if you could speak to the impact that you think the rapid urbanization will have on society.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think about this all the time. And it's changing so much, right? Like some Jordanian Americans here, if you've been away for 5 years, you might come back and not recognize Amman. It impacts environmentally. It impacts the way public spaces. For example, let me just tell you about Rusaife, which is where the jihadi is from. I found footage of that town 30 years ago. You'll not believe what I saw. There were green fields. There was like a river. It was so nice, you know. Carrots, pomegranates, you know, trees. And right now, like, all it is are slabs of beige concrete. And sometimes you can't even see anything green. You can't see anything green. And I really feel like I read this thing in the New York Times about how trees, for example, what they do internally to people, like if just psychologically what they do to people by being around greenery. And we're losing a lot of that even though we don't have much of it. So how does this impact sort of noise pollution? How does this impact day-to-day life? How does it impact in terms of even their health lifestyle, because we don't have proper pavements or sidewalks? So that's like people, where are they going to walk? This is all impacting in many ways. So I see it every day. I think about it every day. And it's so rapid that I think we're all shocked by the rapid urbanization and infrastructure development as well.
Yes, the gentleman in the blue sweater.
Thank you, Rana, for a wonderful presentation. It seems to me like they're using the tree analogy. It's not necessarily economic or political. It seems to be ideological, a form of groupthink that's not limited to Jordan, but all the Islamic classical world that wants to keep a tight grip upon people to keep the status quo. Do not change the status quo. And anybody who writes or expresses that is in danger not only of their life, but of their career. I don't know, how do you address that issue on an ideological level to change that, which one of the consequences is lack of multiple resources of literature in the region, not only in politics, but literature, science, religion. It seems to be an issue of spiritual nature that's not being addressed, or we keep ignoring it.
And education, right? So, I would say Jordan is trying to reform its educational system, but it's still very much based on rote learning and memorization rather than critical thinking and analysis. If you take that to a higher level, you think about Egypt, you think about Syria, you think about other countries in the region. This is how it starts. It starts with the education system, right?
Yes, and right at the front. Friend from the plane.
The infamous plane. So I understand that Jordan doesn't have a lot of economic wealth. It doesn't have oil, it doesn't have gas, it doesn't have minerals. It's not necessarily strategically aligned for military purposes. So what's going to be required to politically get economic stimulation into the country, such as the IMF?
In terms of, I just want to say that in terms of military and intelligence, it is one of the best in the region because, again, there's so much focus on that and there's so much support for that because the West wants to keep Jordan stable and secure, and that's good, that's great. But, we need to move forward from just security and stability into thriving, flourishing. This is what we need. But in terms of stimulation of the economy, I think we need, first of all, we have a very bloated public sector. So 42% of Jordanians work in the public sector. This is not sustainable. So what's the alternative? We need to encourage entrepreneurs. We need to create an environment where it's easy for entrepreneurs to open up companies, to open up startups, and they're going to eventually, if they succeed, they're going to hire people, so you're actually providing jobs. But the environment remains difficult in terms, it's very bureaucratic, it's difficult. The private and the public sector are not encouraging entrepreneurs. So what happens, what I see happening in Jordan is that even if they start in Jordan as an entrepreneur, their eyes are and their minds are, as soon as they grow, they leave to the Gulf because there are so many incentives for them there. There's a hub, you know. So there are initiatives. I don't want to say there aren't. There are initiatives, like even banks are starting to sort of try to help, especially women entrepreneurs. But as generally, I would say it's not a good environment for entrepreneurs. So this is the solution, though, and the government says it's a solution, entrepreneurship, but we're not providing the support for them, even basic support, and neither is the private sector in Jordan. Just if I can give an example, when I was registering my company, of course, after 3 months and so much paperwork to the extent you want to like pull your hair out, I wanted to connect the internet in the office. So they asked, so a private company asked, do you want high speed or do you want what kind of, so I said the one I have at home. So the one I have at home is $35 a month. And as in the office, they want me to pay $60 a month. And I said, why? Because I'm paying, you know, $35 at home. And they said, because you're a company. I said, there are more people living in my house than in the company, you know? But they wouldn't have it. So there are no incentives. And this is not just a government problem. It's a problem with the private sector as well. I didn't end up going with the high internet.
Take another question from Conferences.io. How do you see Jordanian society evolving in the years to come? And also, what are the biggest challenges Jordan is facing in the coming years?
The biggest challenges, again, are economic for me. But to tackle the economic, it's not something separate from political and social reform and development. As for, sorry, the second part?
How do you see Jordanian society evolving in the years to come? And also young people, what impact are young people having on Jordanian society?
My concern is the youth who are now under 35. So if you're in your 20s, you're trying to establish yourself, and this is not happening. So people are marrying much later, they're finding jobs much later, but they can't even support themselves, let alone others, with a job. And what does it mean for these people, for this young people, if in 10 years, like in their late 30s, they realize that they still can't fulfill their ambitions, they can't move forward. This is my concern. I want to be optimistic, but there's a very large population that is in a very dire straits at the moment in Jordan that need help. And they are very smart, they're educated, but there are no opportunities.
We have time for a couple more questions. Yes, the gentleman at the back.
So I know when we talk about stuff like this, very often we talk about, how could Jordan change? What could they do differently? But from an area and a region with such a diverse history and so much cultural knowledge, what could we in the U.S. learn from a place like Jordan?
I think Jordan is very good at sort of tolerating and trying to include many people from different cultures and faiths together. We need to preserve that, but this is a lesson I see here and in Europe that they struggle with, is how to assimilate the other, especially today, and this fear factor as well. This is, I think, what makes us proud in Jordan, is the fact that we are able to take 650,000 people, and you never hear about someone was shot or because they didn't like the Syrian or something. So this is really an accomplishment for Jordan, and something I think that Europe and the US, and arguably the US is a nation of immigrants, and it thrives on that. So it should continue to think that way,
Time for one more question, and the gentleman, the third row.
You made a very brief reference to potential impact of the changing alliances in the Middle East with the Saudis, the Gulf states, Israel, the United States, and you didn't say this, but kind of a preoccupation with Iran. And what does that mean? Could you say more about what that could mean for Jordan, what the implications are for its future role?
Sure. So if I want to talk specifically, I'm talking about the deal of the century, which none of us know what it really is, or maybe one of you does. You should tell me. And the relationship between Jared Kushner and Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, and sort of sidelining Jordan in terms of not what is the deal, but what is the impact of the deal going to be on Jordan, and let alone completely not having the Palestinians and their opinion in that deal itself. So it's a relationship that is very much a personal one, but big decisions are made on behalf, and sort of this obsession with Iran is the enemy, and how that is changing alliances and sort of policies within the region, and the way that they deal with Sunni countries, with whether it's Jordan, whether it's Yemen, what they're doing in Yemen. So it's really kind of impacting. Let me just say that the deal of the century, the most country that will be impacted by it is Jordan. And the reason that it will be the most impacted is because what happens to the West Bank, what happens with the right of return or no right of return, and by sheer of its population as well. And in terms of Jerusalem, as you know, the king has custodianship over the holy sites. So what does that mean for Jordan as well? And sort of decisions are being made based on two things: Iran, and the obsession with Iran as the enemy, and secondly, this relationship between Jared Kushner and MBS, and sort of sidelining Jordan, and pressuring Jordan with Saudi Arabia with basically economic packages. And then that impacts Jordanian foreign policy. Did I address your question? Okay.
Great, that's all we have time for. But I would like to say that Rana's book, Voices of Jordan, will be available for sale and signing from the bookseller. So please feel free to stick around. Thank you very much, Rana, for that lovely presentation.
Thank you.